All right, welcome back to the Python Fundamentals course. My name is Mitch Edwards, or Viking Dev, or Viking Sec, or whatever else you want to call me. I go by many names. So in the last episode, we talked about variables, and we're going to jump right back into the code. I'm going to do a very quick review on that, but if you want a full kind of lesson on variables, you can go back and watch the last episode. I will have it linked above, I promise. So in this episode, we're going to go over arrays, but we're going to do a quick review on variables first, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So you've got var1 equals 75. So var1 is the name of the variable. That's how you will refer to the variable later on. 75 is the value, and it has an implied type, which means it has a type that you don't have to explicitly write out of integer. An integer is just a whole number without a decimal point. If we wanted a number with a decimal point, we could do var2 is equal to 75.6. So that is called a float. So you've got integers right here on the first line, you've got floats on the second line, and you've got strings on the third line. So var3 is equal to cat, and var4 is also going to be a string called dog. So we can do basic addition, but in order to print it out with the way that we are doing this, we're running it in a file instead of using the interactive mode. In order to print out these variables, we use the print function. I promise we are going to go over functions later. It's not super great to cover them super early, but just kind of trust me here. The print function is just writing out print, which is a reserved word in Python, meaning you cannot create a variable called print unless you can. Yeah, so you can't create a variable called print, but print takes in basically things that you want to print out to the screen. So we've got var1 plus var2. So we want to print out the result of var1 plus var2 here. We can also do print var3. And we can test out string concatenation, which is just adding two strings together to create a new string that is just one string tacked on to the end of the other. So we can do var3 plus var4. So here what we're expecting is 75 plus 76, or 75 plus 75.6. Then it should print out var3, which is cat, and it should print out var3 plus var4, which is a string concatenation. So let's save it. I've already got it saving to a file, as you can see above, and we are going to run it. So we get 150.6, cat, and cat dog. So as you can kind of see here, the really only confusing thing is the string concatenation. If you add two strings together, all you're going to get is the two strings stuck together. If you reverse the order, it is going to reverse the order that it is actually concatenated in. All right, so now that we've done a quick review on variables, let's go over arrays. Arrays are actually another variable type, and what they are is just a collection of other variables. So we can kind of illustrate this over here on our whiteboard. So let's visualize arrays a little bit. A normal variable, like I said, can be visualized as a bucket. So we're going to draw out a really ugly flower pot looking bucket, and we've got our tape on the front that gives us the name, and this is var1. So var1 can take in any number of values that are going to determine its implied type. There we go. So this is just a normal variable. This is not an array. If we're talking about arrays, arrays are essentially a collection of buckets. So we are going to take, let's erase this a little bit so we've got some room. So let's create a collection of buckets. And here's how this is going to look. We've got one bucket. We're going to make them small, but I'll make sure that everybody can see everything. Two buckets. Three buckets. They're getting progressively uglier. And let's just make it short. Let's make it a 4-bucket array. So these are all incredibly ugly buckets that are not going to have a name within themselves. Let's just say they're sitting on a shelf. And the shelf is going to represent our array. So we're going to name this array, just like any other variable, we're going to give it a name. We're going to call it ARR1 or array1. And that is going to be the name for this entire collection of buckets. And what you can do with this is you can put 0 in there, 75 in there, 84 in there, 92 in there, and you've got 4 different numbers within 4 separate buckets, all part of the same array. Now, why is this valuable? It's valuable in a ton of different applications of computer science and programming in general that you'll get used to later on in the future. It's important to kind of understand that arrays are just variables. They are variables in the exact same way that an integer or a string variable are. But the purpose of arrays is to group other values together. So all of these values right here are grouped together in the exact same array. Now, I told you that they don't have names. That is technically true and technically not. They don't have names. They have what's called an index. So an index is just a number starting at 0 all the way up to the length of the array minus 1. The length of this array, we can see there's 1 bucket, 2 buckets, 3 buckets, 4 buckets. The length is just the number of buckets that it's got. So that equals 4. And I'm going to show you how you can actually print out the length of an array here in a second. So the length is 4. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 buckets. But since you start counting at 0 in most coding languages, I actually just recently learned it's not all coding languages, but in most coding languages, you start at 0. So the index here is 0, the index here is 1, the index here is 2, the index here is 3. And the importance of indexes is that you use index to refer to which bucket within the array that you're actually trying to access. So if we wanted to add up 0 and, well, let's make it something more interesting. If we wanted to add up 75 and 92, we would refer to them as their index. And here's how we would do that. If we wanted this result to be stored within its own variable, so let's call var1 is equal to, we're going to do it the exact same way as any other variable, the name of the array, R1, an open bracket, and we're going to reference the index of the first number. So ARR1 at 1, you usually say like at here, that's the typical way to say it, plus, and I'm going to have to write it on a new line because I didn't manage my space very well, ARR1, the exact same array, open brackets, at 3. So that is going to look within the bucket at index 1, so right here, and give that the value that's in it, so 75. And it's going to look in the bucket at index 3 and assign this variable, essentially it's a temporary variable, the value that it finds in it, so 92, and it's going to actually add those two numbers together and store them within var1. So let's look at this, and we're going to learn how to actually create variables here in a second, or create arrays here in a second, sorry. So let's write it out. We called it ARR1 equals 2, and the way to create an array is with those same exact brackets that we talked about before. And each individual item within that array is going to be written out. Let's start it at 9, and then we've got 42, and we've got 54, and we've got 17. So you write out the value within each index of the array, followed by a comma. It's basically saying, I want this one, this one, this one, and this one. And you are adding all of these things together. Now I said earlier, we're going to find the length of the array. We are actually going to use another function. I know I'm going to talk about functions soon. It is not a great thing to just immediately start the series on. So we're going to talk about functions soon, I promise. But first, we're just going to kind of, just trust me on this one. If you want the length, we're going to print it out. And we're going to say len, which is length. It's short for length. Then open parentheses, ARR1, and close parentheses. And that's going to print out the length of the array. So let's go ahead and count this. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 items in the array, so we're expecting this to print out 4. So let's run it, and we get 4. All right, so let's access these items. Let's say I want to add 42 plus 17. So let's do print ARR1, and 42 is at the second item within the list. But remember, we start at 0. So it's going to be 0, 1. So we're going to do ARR1 at 1 plus ARR1 at, I think I said 17. So we've got 0, 1, 2, 3. So ARR1 at 3. So when we print this out, we should get the result of 42 plus 17. We run it, and we get 59, which, my math is right, that is correct. So that is arrays. I'm going to explain why we kind of immediately jump to arrays in the next episode. It's important that you understand arrays first before we move on to the next episode, because the next episode is going to really, really heavily depend on an understanding of arrays. So before we stop off, let me go ahead and guarantee you can also use any other variable type within array. So ARR2 is equal to, same thing, open and close brackets, and we're going to do a string array this time. So cat, dog, hamburger. So let's print the length of this, ARR2. And let's do a quick string concatenation because you can do that as well. So print. So let's do ARR2 at 0 plus ARR2 at 1. And we should get 459. That is the length of our second array and cat dog. We look at this array, 1, 2, 3 items, so that length sounds about right. And then our string concatenation works the exact same as if we had a normal variable containing cat plus a normal variable containing dog. Now, here's when we start getting into something kind of weird. There are best practices in programming. Best practices are essentially not necessarily rules to programming because you can break them, but they're essentially ways that you want to write code in order to avoid getting errors. Here's your first example. We can create an array that has, let's do 54, 73, cat, 49, then the string 3, dog. So you can mix all of this stuff up. Now, here's why you shouldn't do that. If we were to kind of do the exact same thing, so let's do print ARR3 at 0 plus ARR3 at 2, we're going to get an error. And the reason is we have mixed strings in with our integers. We're trying to add ARR3 at 0, which is 54, plus ARR3 at 2, which is cat, and that's obviously not allowed. If these two things were in their own separate variable, it would be a little bit more clear. So good practice dictates not mixing up your types within arrays. Even if you can technically do it, like we can run this perfectly fine. Python doesn't care that we're mixing it necessarily, but you shouldn't because it's going to lead to errors down the line. You want your entire array, so if we go back and look at the shelf, you want all of those items on the shelf or all of those buckets on the shelf to hold the same type of variable within them. So here you see a 0, a 75, an 84, and a 92. Those are all integers. You don't really want to mix strings in with those integers. You don't really want to mix those two types together. Now, if you've got integers and floats, those are two different types of numbers. That's perfectly fine. For the most part, you're not going to run into any problems there. But mixing in strings into the mix, probably just not a good idea. Even if you can, you shouldn't. That's programming best practice. I'm going to try to make note of best practices throughout this series just to kind of teach those things from like the foundational level instead of you having to learn on, later on down the line. It's just best to kind of understand those things before you kind of run into issues with them in a job or in programming later. So thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this series, I would really appreciate a like. If you want to watch more of it, obviously hit subscribe and hit that little bell icon that's going to tell you when a new episode of this series or any of my other series goes live. I appreciate it. Take it easy. Peace.